It's Nicholas and Jonathan here. We're joined by Jennifer at RBC, a mortgage specialist. I'm sure you've seen us in other interviews with Jennifer. She's a great resource. We've got the topic of today's discussion is investors re-entering the market after, I'd say, a brief hiatus. But they're getting back into the market and they're seeing that potential there to make money, to profit from real estate. Why not? So Jennifer, basically how we want to introduce this is, how do investors go about approaching this? How do they, what's their first steps to kind of get into the market?
Which is a great question. And thank you for having me on today. I think the best way to look at buying an investment property is to kind of break it down into steps. And so the first part that I think is incredibly important is that we want to have a discussion about what is required to be a landlord, what is required to be a mortgage holder of an investment property. And normally the best place to start is, where is your down payment coming from?
So in terms of down payment, what would be the most advisable for you? I know every case is a little different, but I guess we'll go with what you do the most frequently. What do you find is the most effective way for someone to get their down payment?
So I'd say about 90% of the investors that I work with are borrowing a down payment. Now, there's always an option to have cash to use for a down payment, but majority of people are looking at, how do I use the equity in my home in order to use that for a down payment instead of pulling from investments or pulling from cash. So one key thing with investment properties is that you have to have 20% down. You cannot buy a property as an investor to be a less than 20% down or default insured mortgage. So it needs to have 20% down or more. And it has to be either from your own funds, so that can be investments, not RSPs. I don't recommend, because that's going to have a taxation implication on you. Or so cash, investments like non-registered or TFSAs are a great source for a lot of people, or borrowing against the equity in your current home. As we all know, values have gone up, so there is equity to borrow if you can qualify to do so.
And I guess with that appreciation we've seen in the last couple of years, it's not really going to affect people's debt ratios too badly if they're borrowing that 20%.
Absolutely. And I think, when we look at this, everything is done under the stress test. So like right now, specifically, I'm working on 4 applications where I've got individuals that are going to potentially convert their existing property that they own into a rental property and buy a new one. Or they're going to take equity out of their existing property that they currently own and buy a new one using the equity as a down payment. And so when we're doing those types of qualifications, first scenario where you're buying a new primary residence is a little easier to qualify on, because we can get something called market rent on an existing property. And that's really, we send in a appraisal individual to go in and tell us, well, what would this rent for? And it's an independent person outside of working with these 2 guys. So when you have that allows us to add it into the application and see, what can you qualify for?
Okay.
If you flip it around to the other side and buying an investment property, a new investment property, we're going to rely on the expertise of John and Nick to say, what is this property going to rent for? Does it work within numbers? And that kind of gets me back to, most importantly, we need to sit down and understand an individual's financial picture to say, are you ready to be an investor or are you not? And what can you do to get there if that's a goal that you have?
Okay. And in terms of one thing we were talking about, pre-qualification, obviously that's all going to be done through RBC in your case. And they're going to look at their debt ratio after they've borrowed that money for down payment and with the potential rent.
That's exactly right. So we want to look at the full financial picture. And when we're adding in rent, what we do with the rental income is we can't use 100% of it. So if you've already purchased a property or have bought a property at this moment where we're going to get market rent, or the estimated rent that property is going to generate, we use 80% of that and add it into the application to qualify. So that's an important piece, because there's a lot of lenders out there that won't use all of that. They'll use lesser component of the rent that the estimate is going to be. So we use 80% of it, and that really helps to qualify. So you're not just using your salaried income or self-employed income to be able to qualify. We're adding in the rent and making sure that the full financial picture makes sense for everyone.
No, that's great. And I think you had wondered about multiple properties, right? Potential for people who have multiple properties, if there's a cap or. Absolutely, yeah. Is there a limit to how many properties they can have as investment properties?
So I would say the answer to that is no. It's just structured differently. So
Right.
I work very closely with my partners in commercial lending. So when you get to a certain point where you've got more than 5 investment properties, because at RBC currently our policy states you can have 9 properties, but 5 of them can be investment properties. When you get beyond that, there's exceptions that we can request, but there's also very much the, how do we bring in our commercial partners to say, what can we do next? Because once you get to 5 properties, it's a business. And when it's a business, we need to look at what's the tax implication of holding those in either a personal name or putting them in a corporation, and building upon that, because when you're 5 plus, it's a commercial business that you need to have a strategy and maybe an operating loan to be able to service that next level. So I wouldn't say that there's not a cap on properties. It's just, it's going to change on how we lend at RBC.
Yeah, for sure. And good news, the OSFI obviously decided not to adjust the stress test rate.
Yes.
But yeah, but if now they did say that there is room there to make an adjustment, if I suppose the market conditions necessitate it, what kind of implications would that have? Particularly if you locked into something before those changes came into effect, would that impact you or?
So normally what happens, and what we've all seen over the last number of years, is that when they make that type of change, there's usually a cutoff date that says if your application was started prior to, or if your application has to fund by X. So those types of guidelines are provided to us to say, hey, we need to have a pre-approval in place, an application that is, ready to go prior to X date. And then you wouldn't be subject to the new guidelines. So I think we're ever evolving in the market right now. And that's the one thing I think that's constant in our industry is change. So we're, right now, yes, the stress test is held at a current rate of 5.25% or a rate plus 2%. So whatever is higher is really what we're looking at.
Right.
But if that comes down, which I don't anticipate, but if it does come down, then the new guidelines would come in play and it would affect a person's affordability positively. If the stress test goes up, it's going to affect them in a negative way, in that you can't borrow as much funds or may require you to put a higher down payment from another source.
Right. And what are some of the major pitfalls that you see from investors? Obviously some people go through the ringer before you meet them. We've had clients where we've had that. They've maybe had this over on the second property and they meet us. So what are some kind of common top 3 things that you might see people making mistakes on?
I'd say, okay, the first thing is not being prepared. So whether you're a first-time investor, you're a fourth-time investor, you need to have a plan and you need to understand the financials of a property before you go and put an offer in. In today's market, as we all know, the market is extremely strong and very competitive. So you want to ensure that we've got all the information available prior to signing that, DocuSign document that says I'm putting an offer on a property. We need to understand, does the property taxes, the condo fees that may be applicable, does the, is there any other types of obligations on this property, whether it's like an HVAC system or there's a rental on a hot or water heater rental, like all of those impact the overall affordability. So I put together a bit of a spreadsheet that I do with all my clients. And one part of that spreadsheet is, does the numbers work? So if you get $2,500 in rent, does this property make sense? And does it make sense for qualification? The other side of it is, we look at it from if you got 2,500 in rent, are you going to be net positive at the end of the month, each month, or are you going to be net negative? Now, as we've talked about in the past, amongst the three of us, sometimes you want to be negative. And that could be because you're a salaried employee and you have no write-offs for your taxes. This is a self-employed business, so you can write off a lot of the expenses, and maybe that will have a positive impact on your overall tax situation. Or if you look at it as an investment, truly it is an investment, but in replacement of maybe a traditional investment like an RSP. So if you're putting $200 in an RSP today, or you're negative $200 on an investment property, what's the difference? One's going to grow in value, the other is going to grow in value. So, there's different ways to look at this, and different kind of, goals from an investor standpoint of what's going to be important to them. And so it's not always going to be positive cash flow, but that's okay. You have to look at the short, the medium, and the long-term growth of this particular property.
No, and that's true. I mean, some of our clients who bought more recently with the higher prices, they're either at a break even or a slight loss, but they've told me they prefer it that way. Yeah, and the appreciation that they'll get from holding on to real estate, especially in today's current market conditions, even if they're at negative cash flow, they'll enjoy that appreciation. Yeah, in the last 8 to 10 years, most of our clients' portfolios have doubled. Yeah, especially if they're in Halton region. If they're further out, they've recently in the last 5 years seen a boost, but the last 10 years have been very, very healthy and robust for the market out here. And I think the long game, there was that old adage, you never get rental income and appreciation. You usually get one or the other, right?
Yes.
You bought out in London, you would get the income because you could have a duplex or triplex. And then Oakville, you count on appreciation. These days, rent's strong. Yeah. So you can get a reasonable amount, but I think, like you're saying, play that long-term gain. And is it difficult, say they want to buy that second or third property, to pull equity out of an existing rental if they built up?
So I always set up my clients with kind of a strategy. If you're buying your first one, we can't just think about the first one. We have to think about the fourth one, right? If that's your goal, is to buy multiple properties, you need to put a plan in place right up at the front, like the first property that you're buying. So what I utilize with my client is something called a home line plan. And that home line plan will, whether we're using it to take equity out of an existing property for the down payment, in which we can segment off, so have a separate mortgage within the whole plan that would be utilized, as the down payment, but also have a clean write-off for your taxes, which is a really important part. But setting that up on each individual property that you buy, what will happen, as an example, let's say you start with a $500,000 mortgage on a property, and your principal payment is $2,000 a month. And so that's what your tenant is paying for. So again, that, appreciation is sometimes not necessarily market appreciation, but just the fact that your tenant is paying for your debt for you. But when we look at this, each $2,000 principal amount is going to shift over into a line of credit available. And when that happens and it starts to grow, then we can draw down payment from one property to buy the next one, and so on and so on. So it's important for us to have that long-term plan, which is why I have that spreadsheet for my clients. And, we start to look at, okay, here's property 2. What does it look like? Oh, you want to buy 2 and 3 together. That's a different strategy. So the best advice I'd say is that we really need to sit and have a plan, know what the goal is. We can always pivot, but ensure that we've got that mapped out to get to where they want to be at the end of the day.
Absolutely, because you don't want people getting in over their head, right?
Exactly.
And everyone thinks they can be a savvy investor. We see it all too often because there's Instagram people that everyone follows, who preach it, make it look like it's very easy, but it takes a lot of work. Absolutely, you need to go into it with both eyes open, and obviously have great contacts to advise you
Mhm.
on how to get into the market and how to be a landlord,
Yeah.
essentially.
And there's a lot of
And that,
expenses.
yeah, that's the thing I think is the most important is like, are you ready to be a landlord?
Yeah.
You know, and it's not always you can't always look at it just from the financial aspect. You got to look at it from the, how do you manage this? And maybe you have to hire a property management company. Maybe like, there's a lot of different things that go into this, but having a team of professionals to work with like yourselves, like it really does make the process that much easier.
No, and same with you as well, to have transparency in the actual math behind things, because we always tell people, don't just look at it as the house and the mortgage payment. You might have unforeseen expenses. To buy anything under like 800,000 in the Halton area, it's going to be a condo fee. So how does that factor into your qualification? And it is a deductible expense, but you know, it's still an expense.
Yeah.
So people have to be aware of those things, right?
Right. Yes.
Perfect.
100%.
Okay, Jennifer. So we really appreciate you taking the time today. You gave some great advice, some great info, and we really appreciate it. So
Yeah, we're going to
thanks
drop Jennifer's info below.
Absolutely.
For anyone who has any questions.
Yeah.
And she's a wonderful resource. We recommend her highly. So hopefully, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out.
Yeah, absolutely. And she can fill you in on RBC and all their programs. They have, of course, a program for investors as well. So be sure to get in touch if you're interested, and she'll tell you how they can help you out.
Thanks, guys. Have a great day.
You
Thanks,
too.
Jennifer.